Hi everyone, this is Enrique Guerra Medina from Art, Then and Now. Thank you for joining us today. This podcast is designed to bring you trends, insights, history, works, and biographies of artists around the world, broadcasted from our studio in Lima, Peru. In today's show, we're going to talk about China's New World Order. Starting from the Russian Revolution, the spreading of communist ideas overflowed the entire world. For most idealists who believe in social justice, the extraordinary switch of power between the owners of everything and the owners of just little or nothing represented hope for millions of people whose well-being had been neglected on behalf of the elites. It represented a huge switch in the social and political paradigm that social scientists and economists could not afford with ease. The Russian Revolution of 1917 represented a new future for the whole humanity, a new way to rule human society, and the possible vanishing of inequalities everywhere in every single country. That was what it looked like. The entire world population had been living the consequences of inequality since so long that it is hard to think a time when peasants from medieval times or workers from the industrial era could have lived with no restrictions to food, housing, health, and education. Along history, just upper classes had been able to satisfy their luxurious needs based on the miserable lower classes' work. This has been a regular pattern where a few ones on the top of the pyramid have always controlled the massive ones at the bottom. There wouldn't have been surprising that this movement, that started in 1917 with the insurgency of the Bolshevik Party against the Emperor Romanov and a civil war between them and the anti-Bolshevik movement, had had a complete success, since most of the population needed urgent social, political, and economical changes in their own lives. So, this movement should have supposedly been massively supported by Russian needed people then. That should have been the reason of its success, but that wasn't the real reason. Some research shows us now that the success of the Russian Revolution was not a matter of massive support, but the result of a precise evil plan coming directly from Wall Street. In his book, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy, 1995, Chapter 5, Karl Marx and his manifesto, Anthony Sutton describes how it was. Quote, "Unfortunately, for Marx, the working class has never had too much liking for communist revolution, as we saw in the revolutions of the 1980s. In practice, communist revolution is led by a handful of communists. How can a revolution be made and kept in power by a small group? Only because communists have always had help from the so-called ruling class, capitalists and bankers. This aid and assistance has been consistent from financing Marx's manifesto in 1848 down to the late 20th century, when a David Rockefeller-dominated administration is helping communist revolution and revolutionaries in Central America, Angola, and Mozambique. Even there are some hard proofs that would support the idea that Marx's manifesto could have been a copy-paste work from an obscure writer called Victor Considerant, Principe du socialisme manifeste de la démocratie au XIXe siècle. Published in 1843 in France, 1 year before the publishing of Marx's Manifesto. That is another story. By the time the 1917 Second Russian Revolution took place, it is said that Russian population was in a complete state of abandonment because famine and other factors. History books talk about Romanov's lack of leadership abilities to make Russia strong and progressive. In spite of these records, there is information that stands up for the unique abilities that Romanov have to turn his country into the richest country in the world. With an overwhelming cereal production that could have easily surpassed the ones from the US and other big cereal producers then. It was precisely this extraordinary Russian richness that attracted American bankers to finance a movement that had been started since 1905 with the First Russian Revolution. The purpose was obvious: to defeat Romanov and control as much of his wealth as possible. In words of Lenin, the Bolshevik leader who ruled USSR during the first post-revolution years, quote, "The first Russian Revolution in 1905 was the great dress rehearsal, without which the victory of the October Revolution in 1817 would have been impossible." Unquote. Coming back to Marx's Manifesto, it is interesting to notice two of its big measurements in his plans. One is the abolition of the right of inheritance, and the second, the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with a state capital and exclusive monopoly. The abolition of the right of inheritance represents a regression in the historical social rights development of individuals, since personal and institutional assets do not necessarily create social differences. This is an anarchist viewpoint conveniently explicit in Marx's Manifesto. Accepting the idea that someone can take away our rights because it is necessary cannot be accepted in any way. This reminds me of a very interesting priest speech. The speaker mentioned that celibacy became widespread in 11th century, not so much because of scripture as for simple economics. Widows of married priests were claiming inheritance rights to church lands. This obviously happened when priests got gifts coming from people who felt that they had been touched by a miracle or something alike. In spontaneous exchange to these miracles or spiritual favors, used to donate lands, jewels, and precious metals to priests. This is something that still happens, and priests cannot own these valuable donations, but the church. Going back to the 11th century, this was not convenient for the church, which wanted to have total control over the clergy's properties. Canceling priest marriage and creating celibacy was a way the Catholic Church achieved its objective of blocking possible priest inheritance. It is a well-known fact that cloister nuns have to sign a document to donate all their possible properties or inheritance to the church by the time they are assimilated in the convent life. Once again, the Catholic Church tends to accumulate fortunes, assets, and clergy's mundane properties for the good of the Christian cause. Abolition of inheritance in Marx's agenda looked for the communist state having control over all kinds of property. The same figure was created with celibacy. In the end, just the ones on the top, the bureaucrats of the communist countries, or the Catholic Church hierarchy, for example, are the ones who enjoy no restriction, creating precisely a strong and privileged social class that is over the rest of the population. This has been the regular phenomenon called bureaucratism in the history of communist countries. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state. This is exactly what happened with the creation of the Federal Reserve. The bank-to-bank monopoly would easily, by controlling the entire American economy, manipulate bank interest rates and making a ruler successful or a complete loser. Exactly what is happening nowadays. The centralization of the economic and political power by the state, group of bureaucrats who make decisions for others, is the same figure that presents China's system. The Communist Chinese Party has let China's economy succeed. By contrary, most of the cold communist countries around the world have become isolated and caused serious crackdowns to their inhabitants. Their economy has been paralyzed and become broken. China's success started more than 30 years ago when Deng Xiaoping decided to open China's economy to the world. It was a great reform that caused a lot of social reforms. China became a prominent economic giant. It is interesting to notice that the National Bureau of Asian Research, a non-profit organization, has published the NBR Special Report number 83 by Nadish Rowland in January 2020, where China's vision for a new world order is clearly established. According to this research, China's vision of Occidental capitalism is completely objective in the sense that it has not been able to solve basic human problems like poverty and inequality. Occidental capitalism is a total failure. According to China's view, China's capitalism is the right model to follow, but they need to get acceptance in the West. Westerners are well adapted to the principles of democracy and free market as their main points, but democracy is not only the right to choose a representative or a president. It is the rulers' and representatives' duty to follow faithfully what voters really want for themselves and for the rest of the world. When this connection is lost, democracy becomes just a fantasy. Anyway, Westerners live in a fantasy called democracy, an imperfect democracy. In spite of it, the principles and visions of the Western culture influence strongly in our daily decisions. Turning a look at the China's principles as a valid system for Westerners is not an easy task for the members of the Communist Chinese Party. That is why they have developed a strategy to reach Occidental people and convince them about the benefits of communism. Interestingly, I came across with a free 8-week course at Harvard University. The topic of the subject affords Chinese culture and their ancient way of thinking. Two important points are: 1. Chinese rulers are honest people, because honesty in politics has been an important value practiced by the ruling class. So, Chinese rulers are always honest people. 2. People must obey their rulers. The rulers have always led the country, taking into account the most convenient decisions in favor of the population. These principles that have been traditionally accepted by Chinese inhabitants is, in matter of fact, a way to infiltrate Chinese acceptance of a tyrannical ruling class where there is no possibility for opposition. We need to remember that the Chinese economical success has been based on the systematic stealing of Occidental technology in the form of forced technology transfer. Companies that want to make business in China are required to give for free all their blueprints and commercial lists of clients. This is something that is not written, but it has been a condemned practice by Occidental corporations and democratic leaders. Industrial espionage and hacking coming from China is still a reality. The dangers of 5G technologies have been broadly researched in terms of security issues for US and the rest of the world. It is not casual the apparently fraudulent election of Joe Biden as president of US. He has been for so long a China supporter and he has supposedly business in China. Being a communist supporter hidden in the skin of a Democrat member, Biden and his allies are preparing the final collapse of the Occidental economy by destroying U.S. economy from inside. The no casual increasingly widespread communist governments in South America and the rest of the world, fraudulent elections and infiltrated communists turned into bureaucrats with decision power over presidential elections, has worsened the political scenario. Undoubtedly, all is part of an agenda orchestrated by China's leaders. Democracy is in danger. Will China finally take over Occidental culture and impose its own principles? As you enjoy this episode, be sure to subscribe so you're notified when a new episode is posted. Rate, review, and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope to build a special connection with you and your sensitivity for the arts. Have a nice day.